ladies and gentlemen. This is Dr. Frank Chase Jr. back with you again. We're going to do something different today. I want to share some of my book bubbles with you, some excerpts from my book, Kleptomaniac, Who's Really Robbing God Anyway? And if you didn't know it's out, it is already out on Amazon and all your online bookstores. But today, this video is going to be about sharing some of my thoughts about some of the context of my book. So I'm going to read some portions of the excerpts from my book, and I'm going to share some of my thoughts about that excerpt from the book. And I'm going to probably do maybe 2 or 3 versions of this, and you'll be able to pick up what I'm doing here in a few minutes. But I hope everyone has had a happy holiday season, and wish everyone a happy new year. And yes, I'm going to be starting off the new year probably talking about tithing and doing more videos and writing more book bubbles about the book myself. I hope you get something out of this particular session, because I really want you to understand that the tithing argument is just not going to hold the water. There is no evidence, there is no scriptural evidence that this doctrine is going to continually to persist as it is today, because the truth is coming out in droves. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, tithing is not money, but is food. And in this video, I'm going to share some excerpts with you and some of my thoughts about some of the context of my book. And we'll be right back to do that with you in just a moment. Hold your horses, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be right back. We are back, ladies and gentlemen. So let's get into this, because I really think it's important for you to know exactly what is going on with this horrendous doctrine called tithing. I call it horrendous because it has done so much spiritual damage to people that it is unbelievable. And some of the stories that I've heard about some of the tithing escapades that have gone on inside the institutional church. So in my first book bubble, it is often assumed that tithing is a foregone conclusion. In this first book bubble, I write my thoughts about tithing because I want to make a statement that tithing, monetary tithing, is not a foregone conclusion. And if you think that I'm off my rocker, I want you to listen to some of this that I'm getting ready to read from my book bubble. And my eyes will probably be leaving to the left of the screen, so you'll be able to see that I'm reading exactly from the screen. Now, here in my book, I write, during the Reformation period around A.D. 1570 to 1648 and beyond, many people spoke out against tithing on account of it being unscriptural. The statements below show how massive the campaign was to stop the onslaught of tithing. The peasants in Germany rose up against the Catholic Church on account of many abusers, including abusers related to tithing. Some peasants in Menningham and Slothern rejected tithing completely because the New Testament does not impose this duty on us, 1520, even though they were willing to support their pastor. The Salisbury peasants equated tithing with the work of the devil, since it has no foundation in Scripture. This statement was made in 1520, ladies and gentlemen. The Anabaptists and the swell Anabaptists reacted radically to the use and abuse of tithing, and they called for its abolition. This was done in 1525, ladies and gentlemen, the year 1525. Now, people have been fighting against this doctrine for centuries. J.C. Philpott, from 1802 to 1869, left the Church of England and became a Baptist. He resigned as he was against all tithes. Now, this was way back in the 1800s. Kellogg said that tithing was an unfair burden on the poor and not rigorous enough on the rich. This statement was made in 1891. Pastor G. Campbell Morgan wrote, "I hear a great deal about tithing of incomes. I have no sympathy with the movement at all. A tenth in the case of one man is meanness, and the case of another man is dishonesty. I know no men today who are Christian men in the city churches and village chapels who have no business to give a tenth of their income to the work of God. They cannot afford it." Now, he repeatedly made this statement and was against tithing from 1863 to 1945. Now, another person, Paul Fink, wrote, "Nowhere in the New Testament is it suggested that the believer is to give 10% of his income." Ward, in 1958, critiqued the tithing renewal and gave some reasons to rejecting tithing. And here's his 3 reasons. Jesus' silence on tithing is devastating to tithing advocates, especially considering how often he spoke on money matters instead of tithing matters. Tithing is a hardship on the poor. Tithing sets a low standard for the rich. Mary argued in 2000 that tithing is not Christian because the New Testament does not command it, though it is biblical. He gave 6 problems with tithing. Tithing is inclined toward legalism. Number 1, tithing depends on deficient hermeneutics. Number 3, questionable methods and teachings are used to promote tithing. Number 4, tithing overemphasizes the individual. Number 5, tithing overtakes the concept of stewardship. Now, here's another person. Zen argues that tithing entered the church history due to the union of church and state, that tithes are ceremonial based on Malachi 3, and that 10% had no relationship to Christians. This was as late as 1979. So, ladies and gentlemen, as you can see from the past testimony, tithing was not an agreed practice from the very early stages in history. We went back all the way to the 1400s and 1500s, and we find that tithing was not an agreed upon practice in the institutional church. And we'll be right back to share some of my thoughts on what I think about this from my book bubble. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's get back to it. Now, I read some of my excerpt just in the previous section, and now I want to tell you what my thoughts are about this particular book bubble. When I read that excerpt from my book for you about all of the people who disagreed about tithing from centuries ago, ladies and gentlemen, here are some of my thoughts in the book bubble about that particular excerpt from the book. And I titled it, "Monetary Tithing is Not a Foregone Conclusion." And if you think it is, you should not even think that now that I have read it. And even if you read my book, you'll find out that tithing is definitely not a foregone conclusion. Well, here's what I wrote about that excerpt from the book. Before I had an inkling to launch into the studying of tithing, I always believed that tithing 10% of my income was an undisputable biblical fact, even though suspicions swirled in my mind. As I started digging into the early history of tithing concerning the birth of the United States of America and breaking away from England, I discovered that things weren't so cut and dry in the colonies relating to churches and financial support. In the colonies, there was no tithing to support ministry or churches. The average person who pays 10% would be flabbergasted to discover that as far as back as the 1400s, theologians, religious scholars, and leaders spoke against tithing money in many of their writings. It is amazing how history is soon forgotten when today's pastors and churches want to maintain a monetary tithe invented by man to support clergy. Many of the people in the early history spoke volumes about the New Testament not supporting a monetary tithe, and yet when history proves monetary tithing was frowned upon, many back then and those now still persist in perpetuating the tithe lie. It is a shame for so-called church leaders to distort scriptures for financial gain. History is a powerful truth teller. If you want to know the truth on a subject, the truth will set you free. Especially, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to study the subject of tithing, you will be set free on finding out what the true tithe is, and you will know the truth about it. That's the bottom line. And so we'll stop here, and I'll come right back, and I'm going to share another book bubble with you from my book, Kleptomaniac, Who's Really Robbing God Anyway? We'll be right back. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we are back. Let's look at this one more time. Now, in my next book bubble, I had to talk about money tithing or edible tithing, which one? So here in this excerpt from my book, I want to talk about what people think they know about tithing, because a lot of people want to make the comparison that in the Old Testament they didn't have money, and we switched over to money in the New Testament because we don't grow crops, we don't raise cattle. And all of those arguments are biblically false, because there was money in the Bible, there was food in the Bible, or they used money in the Old Testament, and money was not scarce. It was relatively pretty frequent money transactions took place. And I spent an extensive, detailed chapter in my book discussing what money was in the Old Testament. So here's another book excerpt from Kleptomaniac, Who's Really Robbing God. Cold hard cash plays a role in our society and in the church. And that's no lie, ladies and gentlemen. The money tithe system is the major source of income for the modern church institution. To sustain the influx of money, people must invent fundraising schemes to keep the money flow constant. The Bible even says in Ecclesiastes 10:19, but money answers everything. This Bible verse speaks volumes because pastors and church leaders who support tithing view money as the ultimate answer to ministry rather than trusting God to move on the hearts of people. Weekly cheerleading sermons focus on how important it is for believers to open their wallets and pocketbooks and hand over 10% to God to receive manifold blessings, and let me add, from the windows of heaven pouring out that you don't have room to receive. And by the way, that is not the biblical accuracy on that statement. The argument that you owe God a tithe and you can't beat God giving is powerful in collecting a tenth of income. However, no one ever discusses that theologians, Jewish sects, scribes, pastors, and Christians have argued over the validity of tithing money for centuries. Some of the investigative biblical history on this phenomenon have concluded with certainty that biblical people tithe crops, cattle, sheep, goats, and flocks, but also gave money. Today, those who disagree with mandatory tithing doctrines have garnered the wrath of the institutional church leaders. Some feel marginalized and devalued because of their stand against tithing. This chapter examines many Old Testament Bible verses with the word money. In fact, there are 140 verses in the Bible that use the word money. Believers should research every scripture to discover how biblical people have historically handled money. Money was vital in the Bible. However, some argue that Israel and secular nations did not use money in a significant way. Some believers think Israel's entire economy was agricultural. However, if money was not an important commodity of the time, why are there 140 money verses as opposed to only 38 references to tithes in the scripture? While I cannot cover all 140 biblical references in this chapter, I will highlight some of them to give you insight into Israel's money practices. In this chapter, you will discover whether money was tithed in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. The proof that someone actually tithed money in the scriptures must be clear. Somewhere on the pages of the sacred text, it must be evident that Yahweh converted the herd and crop tithe to money. We know the Old Testament mentions both money and tithes, but they are not synonymous. And I'll be back in a minute, ladies and gentlemen, to read my thoughts about this particular verse, this particular text from my book in just a moment. Now, we are back, ladies and gentlemen. Frank Chase back with you again. Okay, now, I just read another excerpt from my book dealing with this tithing money versus tithing food. When I wrote that, in this book bubble, I kind of shared some of my thoughts about this by titling it, money tithing or edible tithing, which one? And I hope when you read my book, you'll find out the choice is pretty clear. The tithe is food. The tithe is not money, ladies and gentlemen. So here's what my book bubble really reads on this thought from the chapter that I just read, or the excerpt that I just read. The great Jewish historian Josephus wrote that the Hebrew word for tithe is ma'asar. In his writings centuries ago, he stated that the tithe was everything edible. When I began my study of all 140 Bible references to money, it was clear that from the context of every verse that money was not a tithable commodity. So it puzzles me why the modern institutional church continues to peddle the monetary tithe doctrine, even when the scriptures do not support their claims that Christians must pay tithes of 10%. Against this backdrop, the truth about tithing must be told, even at the risk of excommunication from the church. At first, when I studied all 140 references to money, I was certain that I would find one verse where money was tithed to the Levites or to the temple. But to my surprise, not one verse mentioned tithing money to the temple or the Levites. I am convinced that the only way that for people to discover the truth about this centuries-old monetary tithe deception is to sit down and study the subject unencumbered by outside doctrinal teachings, to allow the scriptures, correct hermeneutics, and exegesis to speak loud and clear about what tithing is in the Bible. You must study to show yourself approved, to find the truth. And ladies and gentlemen, that is the understatement. I was studying so hard on this tithing stuff. I mean, I was reading everything I could. I was trying to find everything I could to see if I could find anywhere in the scriptures, anywhere in the Bible where money was tithed. And every time I turned over one money verse, one scriptural verse on money, one after another, there was no references to money being given as a tenth or a tithe or as the ma'asar, which is a Hebrew word, for a tithe. Money simply was not used in that fashion. And so I allowed the scripture to overrule what I had already been taught years ago. Tithes is just not money. It is food. And so we'll be right back, and I'm going to probably read one more book bubble and share another excerpt from my book with you. Hold on, ladies and gentlemen. This is getting even better and better. We'll be right back. I hope this is getting really good information that I'm sharing with you today on my book Kleptomaniac: Who's Really Robbing God. So, in another instance, I went back and wrote another book bubble and sharing my thoughts about another excerpt from my book. And here's what I wrote from another excerpt from my book. In Exodus 30:14, children were never asked to give. Huh, go read that. It was those over the age of 20 who brought free will offerings to God. Here is how we know free will offerings are God's way to give. The word willing in Exodus 35:5 is Strong's number 5081, and it is the Hebrew word nedayib or nadiv. Based on the context of the verse, it means giving voluntarily, generously, and promptly. In verse 21, the word willing in Hebrew is nadab, Strong's 5068. It means to volunteer, to present spontaneously. When you look at verse 29, willing is Strong's number 5071. It is the Hebrew word nadib. It means spontaneous gift. There is no way to interpret the Hebrew text as giving based on percentage. The only method we see implemented in Exodus 35 is free will giving or grace giving. The whole message of New Covenant grace giving is that it is spirit controlled and not man mandated. There is no law that says giving must start at 10% of gross or net income. Grace giving can only be anything from 0 to 100%. Law giving starts and stops at 10% and nothing else is required. However, giving from the heart is limitless and boundless, and it is totally motivated by the Spirit of Yahweh upon the human heart. If you give any other way, your giving does not follow New Testament principles. If you think tithing is money and is connected to the New Testament, the first place to check is Matthew 23:23, which I call the gospel syndrome. When a pastor teaches on money, tithing, the first person they mention is Abram and his tithe. To bolster their tithing position, they connect Abram's single tithe event to Malachi and then tie up the theological loose ends using Malachi 23:23 to form a plausible, impenetrable doctrine. They use eisegesis to string together tithe verses from different books of the Bible to strengthen their tithe argument, while hoping you won't study to connect the dots and find out their teaching is out of context. In Matthew 23:23 and Luke 11:42, the context Jesus addresses is a matter of the law. Since tithing is a matter of the law in Matthew and Luke, there is no principle that can be established for New Testament money tithe. But the question is, what is the tithe in Matthew, Luke, and in Luke? Is it money or is it food? Ladies and gentlemen, that is powerful, isn't it? When you start breaking down things from the Hebrew and the Greek, you start seeing the fallacy of tithing. And so when I come back, I'm going to read to you my excerpt book bubble thought on this particular excerpt. We'll be right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, let's get back to it. I hope you're getting something out of this. And now, in this last piece that I'm going to share with you, I hope you're getting something out of it. So let's continue reading on this. And on that excerpt that I just talked about Matthew and reading about what does true giving look like, I had my thoughts on that particular excerpt. And here's what I wrote about this particular excerpt. I've always been amazed at the psychological approaches implemented in church on Sundays when it comes to money. Getting people to cough up 10% of their income requires real ingenuity. In this excerpt, The evidence is clear that giving is totally free will. Anything other than that is financial manipulation. True giving is certainly not pressure tactics to raise money. 10% of your income being confiscated on Sunday morning through changing scripture does not make it so. Every gift a person gives must come from an open, generous heart. No matter what anyone tells you, tithing is a matter of the law. And don't fall for the new doctrine being peddled today, and that is the invented doctrine of grace tithing. Now, if you haven't heard about this, this is a new twist on the corruption of the scriptures. Now you'll start hearing people talking about grace tithing. Now they're trying to mix the law and then to call that particular law grace. And there is no such thing. So if you hear a doctrine out there or any church that's taught to teach something called grace tithing, you need to run as fast as you can from that, because it is a corruption, it is a distortion of all kinds of verses in the Bible concerning the tithe. When you look up the word tithe and you look up every reference in the scripture to the word tithe, there will not be one indication that it was ever money. And you can check for yourself. You don't have to believe a word I say. Go check the verses for yourself. Go check the scriptures for yourself. And you will find not one tithe verse, which means the Hebrew word ma'asar, was ever in cash, money, gold, silver, or anything that was considered money in the Old Testament. It was never given as a tithe. The only thing that was tithe: bulls, goats, sheep, crops, cattle, grain, and many other edible items that were allowed according to the law. And even some things were not allowed because they were considered unclean. So don't be fooled by these modern tactics. There is no such thing as grace tithing. I'm glad you enjoyed this particular video. I'll come back and share with you some more book bubbles in the future. So long, ladies and gentlemen. We'll see you again.